Hello friends, today we're going to be doing Lesson 3 from Knowledge 9 Fairy Tales. Throughout today's lesson, we're going to see these 5 learning targets. I can review elements of fairy tales. I can identify characters, settings, and events in a fairy tale. I can understand the word delight. I can write using the conjunction because to explain why Rapunzel is a fairy tale. I can use graphic organizers to identify and compare elements of fairy tales. Let's review what we have already learned. So far we've heard 2 fairy tales, Sleeping Beauty and Rumpelstiltskin. Were these tales fiction or non-fiction? That's right, these tales were fiction. Let's discuss some of the elements of the fairy tales that we saw. We've discussed the settings, the characters, the fantasy or events, the problems and solutions, and the ending for both of these fairy tales. So what magical characters appeared in these stories? For Sleeping Beauty, fairies were the magical characters. And for Rumpelstiltskin, the magical character was Rumpelstiltskin. What problems did the characters face? One of the problems that the characters faced in Sleeping Beauty was the 13th fairy's curse. And then in Rumpelstiltskin, one of the problems that the queen faced was she had to guess Rumpelstiltskin's name so he wouldn't take her child. How did these stories end? Well, things turned out pretty well for the main characters, so we can say that the fairy tales ended happily ever after. In today's lesson, we're going to use a Venn diagram to help us organize similarities and differences between or among things. Each circle on this Venn diagram represents a fairy tale. The place here in the center of the Venn diagram is where all 3 circles overlap. In this section, this is where similarities will be listed between all 3 fairy tales. In these 3 sections, where 2 circles overlap, is where we'll list the similarities between 2 of the fairy tales. And in these areas out here, where the circles do not overlap, is where we're going to list the information that's unique to only that fairy tale. So it's going to be where the differences are found. We're going to use this Venn diagram at the end of the lesson to compare 3 fairy tales: Sleeping Beauty, Rumpelstiltskin, and Rapunzel. So let's discuss some more about fantasy versus reality. What do you see in this image? Does this image show something that could happen in real life? Is there anything in this image that is imaginary or that could not happen in real life? That's right. Rumpelstiltskin could not really turn straw into gold. So we're going to add this image to the fantasy column. As we hear more fairy tales, we're going to continue to add to this chart. Let's discuss some of the vocabulary terms that we're going to see in our story today. Delight. Delight means joy or great pleasure. Longed. Longed means you wanted something a lot. Merciful. Merciful means you're able to forgive someone. Rage. Rage is strong anger. Let's review our learning targets for today. I can review elements of fairy tales. I can identify characters, settings, and events in a fairy tale. I can understand the word delight. I can write using the conjunction because to explain why Rapunzel is a fairy tale. I can use graphic organizers to identify and compare elements of fairy tales. Let's look at our purpose for listening today. What is this a picture of? It does sort of look like a salad. However, this is a picture of a special kind of lettuce called Rapunzel. In today's story, the characters experience a problem because of Rapunzel. So let's listen carefully to learn how Rapunzel causes a problem for the characters in this story. Rapunzel. There once lived a man and his wife who more than anything in the world wished to have a baby. Finally, one day, they learned that their wish would come true. Now, at the top of their house, in the very back, there was a little window. and from this window you could see a garden full of beautiful flowers and fresh vegetables. But around the garden was a high wall, and no one dared to enter the garden because it belonged to a mean witch. One day the wife stood at the little window and looked down into the witch's garden. There she saw fine-looking leaves of Rapunzel, which is a kind of lettuce, and it looked so fresh and green that she felt that she simply must have some. Day after day she longed for it. The more she wanted it, the more she became pale and sad when she could not have some. Her husband saw her looking so sad and became worried. "Dear wife, what is the matter?" he asked. "Oh," she answered, "I feel that I must eat some of that Rapunzel from the garden behind our house." Her husband loved her very much, and he thought, "I must get my wife what she desires. I will get some of that Rapunzel, no matter what." That night he climbed over the wall into the witch's garden. He quickly filled a sack with Rapunzel and brought it back to his wife. At once she ate it with delight. Delight means joy or great pleasure. But she liked it so much and it tasted so good that the next day she longed for it twice as much as she had before. So, that night the husband climbed the wall again and picked more Rapunzel. He turned around to go back when he saw before him the angry eyes of the witch. "How dare you climb into my garden, you thief!" she hissed. "How dare you steal my Rapunzel? You will pay dearly for this." "Oh, please," said the terrified man, "be merciful. I only did this because I had to. My wife, you see, is having a baby, and she was looking out the window and saw your Rapunzel, and she needed some more than anything else in the world." "Well then," the witch said, "you may have as much Rapunzel as you want, on one condition. When your wife has the child, you must give it to me. I will take care of this child like it's my very own." The man was so flustered that he said yes, and then tried not to think any more of it. But later, at the very moment when his wife gave birth to a lovely baby girl, the witch appeared and reminded him of his promise. She brought the child to live with her. The witch named the baby Rapunzel, and she grew up to be a beautiful girl. When Rapunzel was 12 years old, the witch took her deep into the forest. There she locked her in a tower with no steps and no door, and only a small window near the top. Whenever the witch wanted to be let into the tower, she would cry from the ground below, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Rapunzel had beautiful long hair that shone like gold. When she heard the voice of the witch, she would open the window and let her hair fall down, down, down to the ground far below. Then the witch would hold on to the hair and climb up to the tower window. A few years passed like this when one day the king's son, the prince, was riding through the forest, and he came upon the tower. As he came near, he heard a voice singing so sweetly that he stood still and listened. It was Rapunzel in her loneliness, trying to pass away the time with sweet songs. The prince wanted to go inside to see her, so he looked for a door in the tower, but there was none. He rode home, but the song had entered into his heart, and every day he went into the forest and listened to it. The song had entered into his heart means that the prince fell in love with Rapunzel's song. Once, as he was standing nearby, behind some trees, who should come up to the tower but the witch? The prince watched, amazed, as the witch called out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Then he saw how Rapunzel let down her long hair, and how the witch climbed up it and went into the tower. He thought, "So that is the ladder. Well then, I too will climb it." The next day, as dusk fell, dusk is the time of day when it starts to get dark, he came to the tower and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And she let down her hair, and the prince climbed up. Rapunzel was greatly frightened when she saw the prince, for she had never seen a man before. But he spoke kindly to her, and told her how her singing had entered his heart, and how he felt he could have no peace until he had seen her. Then Rapunzel forgot her fear, and when he asked her to be his wife, she put her hand in his hand and said, "I would gladly go with you, but I have no way to get out. Do this for me. The next time you come, bring a bundle of silk. Then bring some more each time you come, and I will make a ladder of it. When it is finished, I will use it to climb down from this tower, and then you will carry me away from here on your horse." They agreed that he would come to her every evening, since the witch only came in the daytime. So things went on this way until one day Rapunzel, without thinking, said to the witch, "Why do you climb so slowly, while it takes the king's son only a moment?" "Oh, you wicked child!" screamed the witch. "I thought I had hidden you here from all the world, but you have betrayed me." In a rage, the witch grabbed a pair of sharp scissors and cut off poor Rapunzel's hair. If we say that someone is in a rage, it means they are acting angry. Then the witch took Rapunzel from the tower and brought her to live even deeper in the forest. Later that day, when evening fell, the prince came and called out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." The witch lowered the cut-off hair, and the prince climbed up, but instead of seeing his dear Rapunzel at the top, he saw the gleaming eyes of the witch. "Aha!" she cried, and laughed at him. "You came for your darling, but the sweet bird is no longer in its nest, and sings no more. You will see her no more." Filled with horror and sadness, horror is a strong feeling of fear or shock, the prince fell from the tower. The fall did not hurt him badly, but the thorns on which he fell cut his eyes and blinded him. Blinded means he can't see anymore. So blind and alone, he wandered through the forest for several years, eating only roots and berries and weeping over the loss of his dear Rapunzel. At last he came to a place in the forest where Rapunzel herself was wandering. He heard a sweet voice that he thought he had heard somewhere before. When he went toward the sound, Rapunzel saw him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and wept. When Rapunzel's tears touched the prince's eyes, he could see again. He was both happy and amazed, because he thought he'd never see her again. And so the prince took Rapunzel to his kingdom to be his bride, where she was welcomed with great joy. They were soon married, and they lived happily ever after. So now I'm going to ask you a couple questions about the story Rapunzel. In the beginning of the fairy tale, what does the woman long for from the witch's garden? She longed for Rapunzel. What happened to her before she gets some? She was pale and sad. What does her husband do? He steals Rapunzel from the garden. Do you think there is any other way he could have solved this problem? Tell someone next to you what you think. When the witch catches the husband in the garden, he asks her to be merciful. What does the witch then say the husband must do if he wants Rapunzel from the garden? He must give his child to the witch when the baby is born. Do you think he makes a good decision to agree to the witch's demand? Tell someone next to you what you think. What does the witch name the baby? She names the baby Rapunzel. Why do you think she names her Rapunzel? She's named after the Rapunzel her father stole from the garden and her mother ate. What happens when Rapunzel is 12 years old? The witch locks her in a tower that has no doors and only one window near the top. How does the witch visit Rapunzel now? The witch climbs Rapunzel's hair. Let's look at this picture. How does this prince discover that Rapunzel exists? One day he is riding through the forest, and the prince hears Rapunzel singing sweetly. What happens when the witch finds out that the prince has been visiting Rapunzel? The witch becomes angry, cuts off Rapunzel's hair, and takes her from the tower to live alone in the forest. Then she tricks the prince into climbing Rapunzel's hair, and he falls from the tower. Does the fairy tale have a happy ending? Why or why not? Yes, the prince finds Rapunzel, and her tears allow him to see again. Then they get married, and they live happily ever after. What happens in this fairy tale that is fantasy? So, in other words, what happened in this fairy tale that could not happen in real life? Rapunzel's tears allow the prince to see again. In real life, if we cried on someone, our tears wouldn't heal them. So now, let's see what our word of the day is. In the read aloud we heard, he quickly picked a handful of Rapunzel and brought it back to his wife. At once she ate it with delight. Say the word delight with me. Delight. Delight means joy or great pleasure. I look forward to the warm weather and flowers of spring with delight each year. Can you tell someone next to you about a time when one of the fairy tale characters that we have read about so far feel delight? What's the word we've been talking about? Delight. Let's review our learning targets again. I can review elements of fairy tales. I can identify characters, setting, and events in a fairy tale. I can understand the word delight. I can write using the conjunction because to explain why Rapunzel is a fairy tale. I can use graphic organizers to identify and compare elements of fairy tales. So now, let's look at our elements of a fairy tale chart. The title of our story today is Rapunzel. The setting of a story is the place and time a story takes place. Our story took place in the witch's garden and Rapunzel's tower. Many fairy tales begin in a special way that gives us a clue about when the story takes place. Listen carefully as I reread the first sentence of Rapunzel. There once lived a man and his wife who more than anything in the world wished to have a baby. Although this fairy tale doesn't start with the words once upon a time, the word once tells us that this story also took place long ago. Remember that our characters can be real or magical. In our story today, we had one royal character, the prince. The other real characters are the man and his wife. The magical characters are the witch and Rapunzel. The magical event in the fairy tale is when Rapunzel's tears allow the prince to see again. One problem in Rapunzel is that the woman wants Rapunzel from the witch's garden, and the solution for this problem is the woman's husband agrees to give the witch their baby in exchange for Rapunzel. Another problem in the story today is Rapunzel is locked in the tower and then left in the woods by the witch. The solution for this problem is when the prince finds Rapunzel. The last problem in Rapunzel is when the prince is blinded and left alone in the woods. The solution is Rapunzel's tears allow the prince to see again. Rapunzel ended happily ever after Rapunzel and the prince were married and went to live in his kingdom. So now I want you to write a sentence about why Rapunzel is a fairy tale. I want you to use the sentence starter, Rapunzel is a fairy tale because. Remember, we can look at the fantasy events and the magical characters to help us come up with a reason why Rapunzel is a fairy tale. Here's my sentence. Rapunzel is a fairy tale because Rapunzel's tears allow the prince to see again. Now, let's compare some of the fairy tales that we've heard so far. We've heard Sleeping Beauty, Rumpelstiltskin, and Rapunzel. One thing that was unique for Sleeping Beauty is the good and evil spells. We didn't see any good and evil spells in Rumpelstiltskin or Rapunzel. One unique thing for Rumpelstiltskin is that the queen must solve a riddle. That didn't happen in the other two stories. And then one unique thing about Rapunzel is the main character is not royalty, but she is magical. The main characters in Sleeping Beauty and Rumpelstiltskin were royalty. Now, there's something that was the same between Sleeping Beauty and Rumpelstiltskin that was not the same with Rapunzel. So the thing that's similar between Sleeping Beauty and Rumpelstiltskin is that the main characters are not magical. The main character is royalty, and the setting is set in a castle. Something that's similar between Rumpelstiltskin and Rapunzel, but is different in Sleeping Beauty, is that the main characters solve some of their own problems. Now, there are some things that are the same among all three fairy tales. All three fairy tales happened once upon a time. They had magical characters, they had fantasy elements, and there were problems and solutions in the story, and they all ended happily ever after. Let's review our 5 learning targets one more time. I can review elements of fairy tales. I can identify characters, settings, and events in a fairy tale. I can understand the word delight. I can write using the conjunction because to explain why Rapunzel is a fairy tale. I can use graphic organizers to identify and compare elements of fairy tales. Awesome job today, learners! Happy learning! See you next time!